So welcome to session 3 in our studies in Luke's Gospel, Bless, Love, Forgive, looking at the Sermon on the Plain.
And we start by acknowledging the first peoples of the nations where we each are.
So a prayer which is drawn from Jesus' teachings in chapter 6 of Luke. So we're looking at sections of the sermon under the headings of Bless the Poor, Love Your Enemies, Forgive and Do Not Judge. And there's some writing in the resources that you should have received about the putting together of this material. And then at the end, I've given links to my blogs where I've discussed some of the issues in the shaping of the material in Matthew and Luke in more detail if you want to follow that up. But we're going to start with the well-known, one of the well-known sections of Jesus' teachings. And actually, I looked in preparing for this, I looked, and those of you who've done stuff before will remember that we used the Bible Project with their short little videos. We're not doing that today, but the Bible Project have a video on the Beatitudes of Jesus. They went out on the streets of America and asked people, what are the Beatitudes of Jesus? I haven't watched much of it, but if you want some education about Jesus and American Christianity, away you go. You can Google that and find it. But so we're starting, and you should have this in your material, with the blessings, the Beatitudes, which, as you can see in Luke on the left-hand side, contain a series of blessings and then a series of woes. On the right-hand side, Matthew, the probably more well-known version, the larger set of blessings, Beatitudes. And we're going to start straight into breakout rooms today and give you a decent amount of time, probably about 8 minutes, I think, Elizabeth, for people. If there's someone in the group you don't know, just introduce yourselves again briefly, because we're still in the early stages of this series. And then talk about what similarities you notice across the two accounts and what differences you notice. Okay, so it's straightforward redactional kind of question. What similarities do you notice? What differences between the two passages are evident?
Well, welcome back. What did you discover between the differences and similarities with the Beatitudes in Matthew and Luke?
Longer version in Matthew, which
it is a longer version in Matthew?
Yeah, which includes only the blessed and the rejoice words, whereas in Luke you have the blessed and then you end up with the woes.
Yes. There's equivalent of the woes found in Matthew, but not here. They're elsewhere in Matthew, and they're not quite the same.
Yeah, and the Luke version is a bit longer, I think. No, shorter.
Yes, there's more blessings in Matthew than there are in Luke.
Yeah, they are similar in terms of, in the beginning, they start with the word blessed, Makarios.
Any other comments people want to make about this? And what
it seems to me that Luke is, in some respects, is much more basic. He's not suggesting that people are poor in spirit. He's just saying that they're poor. Of course, most of the population at that stage in the Roman Empire was poor and was struggling for life. So, and most of them were probably hungry most of the time too. So it's, in a sense, it's more basic, I think.
Yep, I think that's a good observation, Piers. And we're going to come to the Greek of this, where that will be borne out. Luke is not being metaphorical. He is not being poor in spirit. He's not being any of those things. You're quite right. They're very stark words that he uses that mean exactly how they're translated.
It seems to me if you could be rich but still poor in spirit, you could be rich but you could be still mourning for some reason or other. As I said, in Luke seems to be getting really down to basics.
Yes.
In fact, he's attacking the rich, isn't he, in his woe, in verse 24.
Well, put it this way, Jesus has got a heart for the poor, and it probably is, he has a hermeneutic of suspicion towards the rich, shall we say.
Yeah.
Our group was concerned with the phrase "Son of Man."
Yes. What about it?
we were wondering if you would clarify where it came from. Is it a reference to a prophecy in Isaiah?
Not really. The Son of Man is one of those vexed issues because it's the title that Jesus uses to refer to himself more than any other title. And it's very, very common in the Gospels. You don't find it much, though, in the Gospel of John. I think there's at
No,
most
there's only a couple.
of references to Son of Man. Nobody knows exactly what it means, except we can say that it definitely has an apocalyptic element to it, because Jesus says the Son of Man will return on the clouds to judge the nations. So there's an apocalyptic element to it that may come from the book of Daniel, where the Son of Man's referred to there. The book of Ezekiel uses the term Son of Man, where God takes Ezekiel to look at the valley of dry bones. And he says, look at these, Son of Man, you know, what do you see and what do you think is going to happen? It's hard to know exactly what it means. It may be a representative term saying, you know, like the son of all humanity. It may be, it definitely has an apocalyptic element, as in the book of Daniel, because Jesus himself talks of that. But it dies out as a title. So because it's not used in the early church, Paul doesn't use it, and it's not found in the letters, we actually don't have a real explanation of what Jesus thought he meant when he actually uses this title.
I found it interesting, because I've been thinking about Son of Man too, and the way it sits in that particular group of words about being reviled and all of that kind of thing, and followed pretty closely by the woes. Whether there's just like there's a reversal there in, you know, the things that we expect might be blessings, like wealth and health and happiness and all of those kinds of things turn out not to be, and the things we think aren't turn out to be, you know, blessings. So is the Son of Man also a reversal? You know, like, is this some kind of glorious or vainglorious, what, you know, a way in which people look for something that is in fact not what the kingdom of God is all about? That's what I found myself wondering. Yeah.
Well, the Son of Man certainly makes it clear that he comes to turn the accepted societal beliefs and values upside down. He certainly is the instrument of that upside downedness, if you like. So yes, I think that would be related to what you are saying.
And it's
Any other comments?
Yeah, on the similarity side of things, you notice that there's only two verses which seem to be almost identical in their framing. It's 22 and 23 in Luke and 11 and 12 in Mark. Slightly different, like there's no Son of Man in Matthew, it just says falsely on my account. But the sentiments of those two verses seem to be pretty well aligned. Whereas I think, as we've pointed out, to some of the differences in the other ways they're expressed in some of the other verses. Yeah, that's a helpful observation, that that alignment and that similarity, though both of them have sort of altered the grammar of it, and and how Jesus is speaking of himself are very similar. So Luke would have been written later than Matthew. So probably, I would say that. Not everyone would agree with me, Bill, I hasten to say, but I would say that, partly because of the Jewish stuff in the Gospel of Matthew, which is much stronger, and that would indicate slightly earlier, and partly because Luke clearly indicates that he knows of the destruction of Jerusalem, where Matthew doesn't. It's more ambiguous in Matthew about whether he knows or not. So it's interesting, because usually the way we look at it in a scholarly sense is, if it's expanded, we say it's later. So people would say Matthew's version's later. I'm not sure it's later than Luke, it's just different.
Yeah, there's certainly some current discussion on how useful if it's expanded, it's later thingo is, because if you actually look at how storytelling and stuff works, expanded could actually be earlier. What people tend to do with storytelling and memory is actually contract stuff as they pass it down, and just keep the important stuff. But I think we're looking at things that authors thought were more important anyhow.
Yes, that's right. They're emphasising slightly different things, though they do come together in agreement on some things. Any other comments before we move on?
Luke
Go on,
was
Piers.
written with Matthew in his available to Matthew.
Do I think Matthew wrote it? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying, did Luke write it long enough after Matthew that he had Matthew's work in front of him?
Oh, that's another disputed area of scholarship, whether or not they just had a collection of sayings that we know as Q that they shared and then altered that, or whether one or the other of them had the other in front of them. I don't know that.
There's a book by an English scholar called Eric Franklin called Luke, Critic of Matthew, Interpreter of Paul. And he's trying to make the thesis that Luke has both awareness of Paul and also awareness of Matthew, and that he's charting his own way in that. But it hasn't been picked up hugely in scholarship.
No.
Well, I've always understood that Matthew was around about 80, which is later than you've actually suggested earlier.
I would push Matthew back to around 70.
Yeah,
Because,
and
as I
that
said,
Luke may not have been written until the early part of the 1st century.
No, I wouldn't push Luke that far forward. Between 80 and 90, probably, I would cite Luke, and most scholars would. I'd push Matthew back to around 70-ish. And maybe a bit before, because as I said, Matthew doesn't have a clear-cut statement, Jerusalem has been invaded and surrounded, where Luke does.
If you push Matthew that far back, then it means that Mark was written before him. It makes him very early too.
I would put Mark in the 60s. But this is me, Piers. You can read 50 scholars and they're all going to give you a different version of this. And there's no knockdown evidence. We don't have a text that says, written by Mark in the year, 59. We don't have such a thing. For a start, there was no time that would suggest that. Well, it's just speculation on the context and the context they seem to be writing within, and how you compare them with one another, how scholars come up with dating. We should probably move on now. Oh, no, we can't. Greg, you had a question. Greg, go.
Well, I didn't have a question. I had a general comment, which I think we might come to. But just when I was reading the Luke, the Beatitudes, I actually found it a bit uncomfortable and cringeworthy.
Yes.
What Jesus is ultimately saying is that you're poor, you're hungry, you're suffering, you'll be blessed. But in verse 23, he's saying that, hang on, you're not going to be blessed just yet. Your reward is going to be in heaven. And I find that can be used really negatively in some ways. Like, he doesn't really provide like some sort of platform of how to get out to what you're feeling at the moment. But is it just the case you just hold on and wait for your blessings in death? Is that what he's kind of saying? So yeah, I've always just accepted it. But when I was reading it, I thought, hang on, this just seems a bit uncomfortable. It just sits a bit uncomfortable with me in a way.
It is uncomfortable. All of us should be sitting on the edge of our seats as the words of Jesus howl down at us through the centuries in our comfortable 21st century existence. I think that the context here historically is really important, how we understand this. If you have a persecuted community as Christians, or a very poor community, and the words that will come to the words Luke uses, and they do mean very poor and oppressed, the only hope they really have is an eschatological one. There isn't a hope in this life. We've got past the Deuteronomic belief that God rewards the righteous, because they know very clearly with wars and other things that have happened, God's not rewarding the righteous. So the whole eschatological idea of a judgment and an afterlife of eternity like heaven and hell comes into being, because otherwise, how do you explain why the righteous are persecuted and not rewarded by God? So you have a whole contextual thing around persecution and the development of a quite sophisticated eschatological belief that there is a heaven, that you have a soul, that it goes there and it will be rewarded for all eternity. And that historical context gives rise to that belief. So that's really important, I think, to understanding these words.
Yes, they're at the sharp end of the persecution, aren't they?
Yes, that's right. So, you know, how do you explain it? How do you explain God's letting it unless God's going to punish those doing it to you and you're going to get a reward somehow, somewhere?
Hope's important.
Hope is very important. And this is as much about hope for these people as it is about any kind of theology. Having said that, though, Jesus, with his heart for the poor, should make all of us who are in the top 10% of the world's wealth very guilty or squirming in our seats or something about how we live and what we do with that particular wealth that we've been given. And that segues very nicely into our next section, which is Reflections on the Poor. And what you have in your notes is a combination of 2 sermons I've done on Epiphany 6, one 3 years ago and one last week. And the poor, the church loved Matthew's Beatitudes. If you Google Beatitudes, you will find memes and other things will come up of Matthew's Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, because blessed are the poor really makes the church squirm. And the church has not liked it down through the centuries, probably because it's one of the biggest owners of real estate in the world. So blessed are the poor in spirit has been much more palatable. And most of us could identify with that because most of us have had times in our lives where we have felt like that. And people have tried to reason maybe Luke meant that, and I'm here to tell you, no, he didn't. And this is the Greek. It's important. Patokoi, which is not just people who are poor or poorer than average or who might be struggling a bit. These are destitute people. These are beggars on the street who don't have a home, basic shelter, clean water, regular food. They are the poorest of the poor, this particular group of people. And the word he uses for hungry, penao, is to be literally hungry. Clio means to weep and bewail literally. So they're not metaphoric. They're not so much symbolic. He's actually saying the literal destitute, the literally starving, and the literally weeping and bewailing because of their lot. And they're very dominant Lucan themes. And we've seen them pronounced on the rich throughout Luke in a number of places, some of them unique to the Gospel of Luke. We have the Magnificat, where Mary says that the rich and the rulers will be pulled down and the poor and the hungry will be elevated. We have the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, unique to Luke, where in Hades, the rich man says, can Lazarus come and just wet my tongue? Because he, of course, is on the fiery burning side and the poor man is on the side where he's got water and other things and he's been comforted. And Abraham tells him, well, no, you had that in your lifetime, so now you are going to suffer the consequences of that. And that's a very serious thing. And is he suffering because he's rich, or is he suffering because he ignored the poor man at his doorstep? He just didn't see him. And there's been weighty tomes written about that and this parable. Luke also sets his sermon differently from Matthew. He's on a plain. It's a literal flat area. I also found this interesting when I Googled this for pictures for my written stuff I send out to people who aren't on Zoom. And every one picture I pretty much found of the sermon on the plain, even though people were sitting on the plain, they still wanted to elevate Jesus. So he's up on a rock or a little, a little hill, or, he's still up above them. And I had a lot of difficulty finding something that actually represented Luke's words, which Jesus comes down and he's there on the plain with everyone. And he heals all kinds of diseases and unclean spirits. And it becomes a level playing field, not only because he's down there with them, but because we've got different ethnicities. It's not just Jews. I mean, this whole universal theme of Luke is beginning to open up here. And it's a place of rich and poor, and it's a place of hungry and full and all these things. And so Jesus is addressing them all about what discipleship's going to look like. So the good news of this kingdom in Luke's gospel is really the world turned upside down. And in a few sentences, Jesus has made pronouncements that the church is going to find difficult and even offensive for centuries to come, and they're going to rush to Matthew in droves because that's the one they like much better. So we have a bit of a question there. Do you want to do this question with the other one, John? We'll just note the liner.
Yes, I've just done one slide for both questions, yeah. Okay.
So you've also got in your material there a quote from Bruce Malina and Richard Rolber, who talked about who were the rich in the first century and the systems of taxation and the rent of land, which gives you a little bit of background to subsistence farmers, beggars, prostitutes, and those who were very, very marginalised, and who was in the city walls and who was out. And you may find that difficult just to refresh your memory on that, so you have an idea of the sort of people Luke's talking about and the society that they occupy. So we're going to put you back into your groups to think about, is it difficult and offensive for the church to actually think about these Beatitudes? Is it comforting or challenging for you? And what are the practical consequences of what Jesus is saying? How does the church live this out? So, well, welcome back, everybody. How have you gone wrestling with comforts and challenges and the practical consequences of the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke?
Well, we were very lucky, Elizabeth, on Sunday for your sermon and your lovely video on the boat and the rescue boat. We talked about that, and that summarized it so beautifully.
Yes, the parable of the sea, or the parable of the life-saving station, if you want to Google it. It's really good about how the church sets up itself to save people and in the end becomes a comfortable social club. So it's well worth viewing. It's a good metaphor, I think.
It is.
Can you give us the contact for that?
I'll look it up and put it in the chat.
I think I'll put it up on our YouTube channel if you like, Elizabeth.
Oh,
okay. If Bill puts it up on the YouTube channel, you can easily access it there. You'll find a number of versions of it online. Not all of them are the same.
I was just saying that the church has suffered the same problem that all institutions suffer. That once you set up powers and authorities to make it run, you also elicit other desires in the human breast, human heart, to gain power and authority. And so what started like that gets turned up onto that.
You lose sight of what you were originally setting it up for. It's lost.
Yes. Yeah. Greg?
I was going to say a good example of this is with the Royal Commission into child sex abuse, where the church and various denominations, you had this power that was kind of just holding on to everything rather than actually wanting to, either apologize or seek to, do some sort of redress to people who have been suffering for many, many years.
Yes. The fame or the reputation and the entity of the institution became the most important thing. And that was to be protected at all costs rather than victims. And that's a good example, Greg. You really do see that at work there. And that's the church is in its worst hour.
I also made the comment that I think we have to remember that we are the church. And to a certain extent, in our group, we looked at Patricia looked at like a political party. And I think in a certain extent, we operate the same way, that if we demand better, because, we're the hands and feet of God. So if we're like, if we're demanding more of our leaders, then maybe things would change in a different direction rather than them giving us what they want and, we just like not doing anything about it in some ways.
So activism is part of turning the kingdom upside down, to actually advocate for a structure that is fair and to advocate for practices that are just.
Patricia her example was a really good one, I thought, which was about the Climate 200 group who, are organising to receive donations in order to support independent people who will, possibly be free of the issues that you find in the major political parties. And I find that a question for me, like when do you organise and work with others? How do you organise and work with others? And when do you just, and also Patricia said, me in my small corner and you in yours sort of thing, because I'm a bit burnt by the organising side of the church, and yet there's definite possibilities.
The thing that really speaks to me about this is that when we give people money and food and shelter, it's not just enough to meet the physical needs. We also need to treat them with respect and dignity. The difference between saying this is a person who is one of who is made in God's image, as opposed to this is a lazy person or a stupid person or a weak person, and we're going to give them stuff because they need it. But yeah, not treating them as a person worthy of God's love and respect.
Yes, I'd probably push that a bit further, Judy, and say that with this metaphor in Luke of equality, where everyone's on the same playing field, we also need to change the structures of society that rely on an underclass of destitute people.
Have you heard of this Climate 200 group? Is that a possibility to support independents?
Well, I don't see why not, because independents have a lot more trouble raising funds for their campaigns historically than the major parties do, for obvious reasons, because people want to donate to the major parties to buy their goodwill and to, you know, buy away with their, I forget the name of the people that go and, you know, present things to them on behalf of companies and mining groups and people who want to cut trees down.
Isn't it climate? I think Home to Court. The son is like has set it up, and he's got other people on board with him.
Yeah. And you know, it's similar to some of the small grassroots campaigns that got Obama elected. A lot of Obama's funds for his campaign didn't come from big rich donors. It came from people like us giving $50 or $100 and what they could afford. And so many of them did that. He was that helped his campaign a lot. So he had multiple small donors rather than a much lesser number of really big donors. But I think it's a good idea. I think we do need to do something about climate unless we have people in the parliament pushing that and standing for grassroots organisations that can clearly be counted as having reasonable numbers in them. Neither of our major parties are going to do much other than tinker at the edges.
But there needs to be a level of transparency in those sorts of organisations as well, so that they don't, because there are some people who have the rhetoric and take the money and feather their own nests, and there are other people who are actually genuine.
I think that's one of the genuine ones.
Yeah, I think so too, but yeah. I haven't looked into it terribly hard.
And I think that if you want lack of transparency, look no further than the parliamentary register of donations and interest. There is absolutely no transparency there, and they've got all sorts of sneaky ways of hiding big corporate donations to them that come through places like the IPA and other institutes like that. And transparency would be good. Banning any kind of donations for political parties would be even better. And then everyone would indeed be on a level playing field. But I will get off my soapbox now.
We need to draw it back to a personal response too, don't we? Like, how do we respond personally? And our little group talked a little bit about the need for the church and us personally to be refreshed or to come back to these core teachings and respond to it. How do we personally respond to this? And we need to have a bit of self-examination as to our treatment of the poor and those who are hungry and so on.
And how much we're prepared to give out of our abundance.
That's right. So self-examination has to have a response, but it's not like individually, but as the community that surrounds us, like our congregation, and then more broadly the church. So I think we have a tendency to excuse ourselves from responsibility by pushing it out to, you know, other organisations or, you know, the wider church to be responsible for doing this. But it comes down to us, like the independence thing. It's lots of little people making a change rather than expecting the broader society to change by itself somehow.
That's part of the institutionalisation of our churches, I think, too, Bill, because I can think of two examples of churches in this presbytery where the church people started out with a vision and established a really good ministry, and both of which are now completely government funded. And where they still have some volunteers and activities for both of them to come in from those churches and do stuff. The church, in effect, outsourced its mission at this point as it grew bigger and bigger. And, of course, there's compliance issues and other issues around that make being part of government compliance and structures and funding desirable. But then I would say those churches should be re-energising themselves and looking for the next thing they can plan and the next thing that they can do that will actually affect society in positive ways. And we're not good at doing that. We get up our church cycle and we're sitting up there on the top of the hill along with Matthew's Jesus, and then we don't swing round to re-energise and do something new. We're very happy with ourselves, and then we start to slide down the slippery slope to oblivion because we think we've done it and we've achieved it, rather than coming back and saying, well, what new thing that's good can we do? So churches should go through these cycles, but increasingly they don't, for a number of reasons.
I think some of the way that we use language, you know, we need to be careful, and this is something I've really, it's occupied me. I live in a poorer part of Sydney, so when I first came, I think I brought a sort of us and them
mentality
to my work there, and to some extent it's true. I'm wealthier and have education and all sorts of things that a lot of people I've worked with haven't. But I've been challenged to break down the us and them, and I've really just seen that it's us and us. And the problem with church is, you know, we have this sort of kitchen counter mentality, I think sometimes, where we're giving food to the poor, but we're safely behind our kitchen benches. Or even, you know, when we say we need to offer them, you know, spiritual this or that, like just the word them. So for me, a challenge and a journey is, it's us. It's that egalitarian, we're all on the plane. Jesus isn't even on a rock. It's more like a yarning circle in, you know, in Aboriginal culture, where there's this radical solidarity with each other. And I mean, I'm not skirting over the fact that I'm privileged in many ways in this community either, but I don't think me giving to them has actually been helpful.
Can I just jump in and say one more thing? Although Jesus was on a plane, clearly he was the one in authority. Clearly, you know, they were listening to him. So I think it's a metaphor. It's useful, but I mean, practically, Jesus was in control. He was in charge. So, yeah, I think I just want to throw that into the mix. Yeah.
He was, but at least he wasn't up on a lofty height speaking down to them. I suppose one has the appearance of equality, but you're quite right.
Yeah.
And Jesus sets himself up that way. Luke chapter 4 makes it clear he sees himself that way. He's the one who's come to right these wrongs.
How do we actually know that it's not the same story, and the interpretation of the plane is really the same as the mount? I mean, he could have been talking to the disciples on the mountain and then come down to the people.
Spoken like a real biblical scholar, Jenny. When the text says plain, it really means mountain.
Mountain.
No, it doesn't. It means a flat area. I'm sorry. You can't conflate the two and say they both happen. The difference is that Luke has a level playing field, literally, where all ethnicities meet and all strata of society meet. Matthew's on a mountain because Jesus is the new Moses, and that's where Moses was, on mountains preaching. So that's why Jesus is up a mountain in Matthew, and where Luke's on a plain. It's to do with their theologies and typologies that they're both using.
Yeah.
And the other thing that feeds into this is that in the latter part of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, there's material that Luke does report, but he doesn't report it as part of the Sermon on the Plain. And there's various sections that appear in chapters 11, 12, and 13 of Luke when Jesus is on the way, on the road towards Jerusalem. So Luke has no compunction about if it was a single incident that Matthew has accurately reported, then Luke has no compunction about deconstructing it to some degree and putting other things in other places. I think it's more likely that it's that there's some kind of common source, like the Q source, that has some of this material ordered in the same way that Matthew and Luke use, but then there's other material that they each. Matthew's got a whole lot of stuff that he brings in that's not in Luke, that reflects Matthew's Jewish Torah focus. Luke's got got some of the material that's in Matthew, but he puts it in a different place when Jesus is on the road teaching about discipleship. So I think we've got two different constructions, and what the historical reality is behind it, as
Who knows?
always with the Bible, is an open question. Shall we move on to love? So in the Torah, we know that the people of Israel are instructed to pray each day, love the Lord your God. It's a prayer that Jesus quotes. And we know that Jesus adds to it something else from the Torah, from the book of Leviticus: love your neighbor as yourself. In John's gospel, the love commandment gets narrowed and focused on the group. Love one another. There's no sense of loving beyond it, but there's a very clear instruction to love one another. Luke and Matthew do something quite different with the two great commandments, love God and love your neighbor. Because Luke and Matthew each say that Jesus says, not only love your neighbor, which he does it in places in the gospel, but love your enemies, which we have here in this next parallel section. And Luke, in fact, intensifies it. He said, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. And that is an intensification of the teachings of Jesus that is really hard to handle. I posted, when I posted a blog about this a couple of days ago, one of the members of our evening group wrote this reflection in response. She'd been to the Lifeline Book Fair here in Canberra on the first day when it was open, before the protesters had caused it to shut down. I found this interesting following my reaction to the more aggressive of the anti-vaxxers I encountered last week. It's a fine line. How do you maintain your own integrity and call out the behaviour? How do you not hate the person, attempt to find some compassion for them, despite the obnoxious behaviour that they are demonstrating? So that's the struggle that's behind this, and that, I mean, Sue kind of earthed that very much in a real situation that many people in Canberra have experienced over the last week. So the question that we've got is, yes, how do we respond to these? Are these instructions for our lives to live? Or is it what some interpreters say, this is what Jesus is saying, and this is what life will be like in the kingdom of God? And so it's an ideal towards which we're moving without necessarily the expectation that we will be able to live it. What do you think about that?
Welcome back, everyone. How are you going with forgiving your enemies, and what do you make of this passage?
Well, we've changed David's name to Grace.
Say that last bit, David, that you just said when it cut out.
Oh, just that we need grace to live, to forgive others, to cope with our own hurts, and if the Spirit is not in our lives, we're going to really struggle with this.
I think the problem is that we mix up romantic love with agape love. And agape love, I don't think is that you're doting on somebody. It's that you care for them in some way or other, even when they're being a bit unpleasant.
Yeah.
Or unpleasant.
I mean, I interpret that as I wish them no harm, you know, and that things may go well for them without necessarily feeling fondness, as it were.
And maybe taking it a little further than wishing them no harm, if you become aware of a need, being prepared to meet or work towards meeting that need. But that's a different, which is about, I guess that thing about respect for someone in whom who is made in God's image kind of thing that I was talking about before. Our group was quite clear that this was an instruction for here and now, not just something that we could hope for in the future, incidentally.
Thank you for saying that, Judy, because I have argued that with other ministers when they say it's an ideal. And I said, Jesus didn't go around pronouncing ideals. He actually gave instructions about how people were to behave. And if they're all ideals, what was the point?
Yes.
I didn't bring this up in the group, but I find it really helpful when Jesus says, pray for your enemies, pray for those who abuse you, because that sort of causes me to focus there with compassion in some way, that underneath all that there's a human being, may have been abused themselves, you know, but I don't want to make excuses, but at the same time, there's something about praying for that person who irritates me that is helpful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Angela. I think that's right.
I think we've sanitized the gospel to make it really like more palatable for people and easy rather than hard. And
That's right.
It is challenging and calls us to change our, what's the word? Metanoia? In our life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To actually change the way we live, not just sort of somehow reshape the gospel so that it's easy for us to live.
That's a really good point, Bill, because like God, we tend to create the gospel in our own image, and we'll reinterpret things about, oh, Jesus just meant this, or he was talking in a metaphor, or this was just an ideal, or it was just to the people of that time. When we do that kind of thing, we lose the real core and the heart of it, which is meant to be a challenging message to us about how we live as disciples of God's kingdom.
But I think there's a complexity in this. The C.S. Lewis quote that has come to mind. She cares for others. You can tell the others by the haggard looks on their faces. There's a wisdom required in this whole business. So again, I'm back on grace and spirit, guys. Can't help it.
I'd also say a good, decent dose of the ability to and capacity to self-reflect what we really mean when we say we're Christians.
Absolutely, Elizabeth, yes.
And I would actually relate that to the last verse in this section, which in Matthew is be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, which sounds really daunting. But in Luke, it's be merciful as your Father is merciful. And,
I prefer that one.
And well, just wait before you vote, because perfect, Matthew also has a saying of Jesus that's saying, if you will be perfect, you should go sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor, later on in chapter 19, to the rich man. But Elizabeth's got a different translation of perfect.
You'll be surprised to hear I have a better translation of what you're getting there. The Greek word is telos. It can also mean fulfillment or completion or whole. I would rather translate this as be complete.
Be whole.
Therefore, as your heavenly Father is complete. So do these things and it makes you a whole person rather than a counsel of perfection.
But in Luke's account, he says, be merciful as your Father is merciful. And there's an ordinary common Greek word for mercy, eleos. Kyrios eleison uses that word, Lord, have mercy. And that appears 55 or 56 times in various forms in the New Testament. That's not what is used here. That kind of mercy means care for the other person, care, compassion, look after the poor. Look after the widow, look after the orphan, that kind of thing. He uses a word which is much more unusual in the New Testament. It's the word oikoumenios. And that word is common in the Septuagint to translate another Hebrew word. And my sense of it is that what he means there is not just care for the other, but I've translated it as demonstrate a deep, compassionate, empathic concern for the other. So there you go. My translation is about 8 words for the one Greek word. It's actually put yourself in the position of the other, which is more than just saying, oh, let me, give you a drink of water or let me help you across the road.
It's emotional empathy, isn't it?
Sorry?
It's emotional empathy as well as action.
Yeah, that's right. So that's a really penetrating thing. So both of those words are powerful, each in their own way. Yeah.
I did a study on the word perfect because it worried me about perfectionism
right.
once. And I looked through all where it says perfect in the Bible, and it seemed, I came away thinking it's saying perfect your love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure it's even saying that in Matthew, simply because if you look up perfect in a concordance, it's probably translating 5 different words, and they'll each have different nuances and things like that. So that is, do not let me discourage you doing your research, but just be aware.
I just didn't want it to, I didn't want it to mean perfectionism.
Yes.
I don't think it does. I really think it means be complete, be fulfilled, be whole.
I think that's really interesting, that idea of wholeness. Like for me, that reminds me of the unity of God, you know, the oneness, the wholeness, the completeness, and seeing ourselves as not separate from that, but as part of it, is interesting for me. It's kind of a bit mystical, but I think it has practical outworkings. Yeah.
And Elizabeth, the Common English Bible agrees with your translation. It's of Matthew. It says complete.
Good. It's right. The NRSV is wrong.
It's wonderful.
I was going to say that the motto of my church is faith, justice, creativity, and inclusion. And sometime last year, we had a series where we looked at the meaning of each one of those things. And when we came to inclusion, my church has like a relatively large number of GLBTIQ persons. And I made the comment that being an inclusive church means that possibly that we also have to accept or provide a space for people who might have a different view, people who might be misogynistic, who might be homophobic, and who might think otherwise. And people are very uncomfortable with that. Yeah. And the kind of consensus was, well, we can't be inclusive to everyone. And I actually find that, just going back to this idea of love, that I think sometimes I find a lot of uniting church congregation, well, sorry, I shouldn't generalize, but in my own case, I think that we try to create a safe space where, you know, everybody who thinks like us and look like us could feel loved, but then that becomes a silo, and you don't actually provide a platform where, you know, people who might have a completely different view, you know, they can be able to express their view and maybe have that sort of challenge. I find that really interesting. Yeah.
Me too.
Okay, thanks, Greg. All right, we should move on because we need to finish in 5 minutes.
Yes, the last section that we've got to look at is based around the instruction to forgive and not to judge. And I've included in the material a quote from a conference Elizabeth and I attended when we were in Perth some couple of years ago. Forgiveness is important, but can't be imposed. Forgiveness begins with repentance and won't be realised until that is genuinely offered. I think there's been some other stuff in the public arena this week about saying sorry and so on. So this kind of taps into that. But we thought that a question for us each to discuss briefly, but to ponder maybe more beyond just this 90 minutes, is how easy do you find it to forgive someone who has wronged you? And what is happening inside you if you find that you can't forgive someone who has wronged you?
Those questions are probably more for pondering than sharing, I think, John. Anyway.
Relating that to the line in the Lord's Prayer that we say whenever we pray it about forgiveness. Yeah. Sorry, Patricia.
No. I find a question that concerns me more than about forgiveness. I mean, the Spirit works on you and hammers you until you learn how to do that. But what is the difference between assessing someone and judging someone?
I suppose judging is saying, go rot in hell. You know, I hope 1,000 bugs infest your armpits and a grand piano falls on your head from great height. I suppose, you know, when you have this idea of judging and you're saying you are wrong, you are not acceptable, and I hope something bad happens to you, because judging comes with bad stuff in the Bible. to assess someone and say, I think that you may be dangerous to my well-being for the following reasons, so I'm going to stay out of your way. I guess you need to do that for our own safety, but that's just my opinion. And this is probably an area where there's going to be 50 shades of grey and plus some, and how people actually see those two things.
As I think Elizabeth has indicated, we need to draw our study to a close. We have to shoot off to an appointment. So there's material, some material that drives towards this. Do these sections that we've looked at suggest we've got two reports of the same sermon, or does it suggest that, as I've indicated before, that we've got two different people compiling material that they have about what Jesus said and compiling it in their own way, which of course is the orientation that Elizabeth and I have in dealing with this material. So we'll leave that with you for pondering. I just want to say that starting today, I'm posting the series that I promised on my blog of Letters to Luke, a series of letters recently discovered.
Yeah, in your filing cabinet.
From Theophilus to Luke, exploring how a first century reader might have received and understood Luke's orderly account. So you can connect to it from my Facebook page. I put a shameless self-promotion post up, of course, or you can go to An Informed Faith at that website. That's the website they've given me. And you can read it, and there's a series that will be coming over the next 8 or 10 days.